Hello everyone, I'm Bart Hopkin. I'm an instrument builder. I like to build all sorts of unconventional, unusual, interesting, non-standard musical instruments, and now I'm working with Soundiron to record a series of sample libraries. Unconventional really is my specialty. I'm happiest when whatever I'm building today is as much as possible unlike whatever it is I built yesterday. And also when whatever I built today is as much unlike anything you ever saw before, anything I ever saw before. That's of course impossible because everything you do is built upon the work of other good people that have explored these areas before, but I do my best. In pursuit of that, I've built all kinds of instruments, all types, winds, strings, idiophones, things that would have to be put in the category of uncategorizables. Here, for instance, I'm just looking around my shop now and picking out a couple of random instruments. Here's something called suction pops. You can probably imagine what that is. Here's something called north, south, east, west chimes. They're chimes specially shaped so that when you strike a chime, it doesn't produce a single note, it actually produces an entire chord. Each chime produces an entire chord. Here's the latest thing that I've completed. This is something called square boos. It's not actually an original idea of mine. What it is it's a set of wooden tongue drums where each tongue has its own personal air resonator attached so that the air resonance is tuned to match the pitch of the tongue. And there are a million more around here. That's a random sampling from what I see around my studio right now. We may get to some more later. And meanwhile, if you're interested, you can check out a whole lot of instruments at my website. That's barthopkin.com. Easy to remember if you remember my name. Bart Hopkin. No S on Hopkin, barthopkin.com. Go to the Instrumentarium section there and you can see sound clips and photographs and descriptions of a ton of instruments. Back in 1986, this tells you how old I am. Back in 1986, I started an organization called Experimental Musical Instruments. Originally, Experimental Musical Instruments was a journal. Started out as a bi-monthly journal, then it became a quarterly journal. It was a journal featuring articles about who was doing what in the world of inventive and creative instrument making. So every issue would have articles about so-and-so someplace, often very far afield all over the world, who was building some really cool thing, had some really cool idea about how we could harness this or that acoustic phenomenon for musical sound. And with the passage of time, experimental musical instruments got into a lot of other things. For one thing, we started doing books on instrument making, how to build this and that kind of instrument, CDs on who was doing what. We put out some really interesting CDs of various makers all over the place and some of the cool instruments they had made. And also, eventually, for the sake of generating more revenue, we got into the business of selling hardware to instrument makers and that kind of thing. But what I want to say here is that doing that stuff with experimental musical instruments, especially producing the journals and the books and all that, was a hell of an education. I really learned a lot. That's where I really learned a lot about instrument making, about what was possible, about what works and what doesn't work, all that kind of stuff. It was a terrific education for me. All along during that time, I was building as many instruments as I could myself, but I was actually awfully busy. I had a whole life, including experimental musical instruments and other things. I always had a million ideas, never enough time to build them, of course. Now, in recent years, I've actually reconfigured my life to put instrument building front and center, and so now I've just been on a tear, building a million instruments. It's been the greatest thing. A lot of ideas that have sat simmering for years and years and years are now actually getting built. So this is great. And a lot of these instruments are going to be included among the sample libraries that Soundiron will be putting out. So stay tuned. We've got a lot of good stuff coming your way. Now, just for fun, I'm going to give a little bit more complete description of one of my instruments. This is the one called Sabartes Wheel. Here's what it sounds like. I like to make some pretty sounding instruments, and I like to make some god-awful sounding instruments. This one's a little bit more on the god-awful side. Here's what's happening with Sabartes Wheel. To explain it, I'm going to make an analogy to a guiro, a scraper of some kind, something where you're dragging a stick across some object that has ridges. That stick is bumping over ridges of the scraper object at some number of bumps per second. And that number of bumps per second actually is audible as a frequency if it's in the hearing range, except that on a guiro, you don't have much control over what that bumping frequency is going to be. So you could never play a melody or even a steady note on it. So Sabartes Wheel is an attempt to mechanize this idea in such a way that you can get the steady frequencies that you want. The basic idea is you have a spindle on which is mounted a set of discs of graduated size. And the spindle is rotating, motor driven, and the edges of the discs have ridges on them. And it's all configured in such a way that for each disc, the number of ridges rotating past per second is the right number of ridges to give you the series of frequencies you want to create a scale. You need to use something as the scraper. It's easy to picture a playing card. Imagine you hold this playing card against the ridges for one of the discs. You'll get a certain pitch, a certain frequency for that disc. Move it to another disc, you get a different frequency. I use something a little different from a playing card, but the principle is the same. Once again, if you want to have a little better information on this thing, you can go to my website, barthopkin.com, go to the Instrumentarium section and look for Sabartes Wheel. By the way, as we get into the idea of recording these sample libraries of my instruments and releasing the libraries, I need to acknowledge that I have no experience in this world, either as a creator or as a user of samples. It's just not been my world. So I'm depending on Mike Peasley and others at Soundiron to educate me as to what's likely to be of value to the people who use samples every day in their music work. One thing I've been hearing, and I've been having a little trouble getting used to this idea, has to do with the question of which instruments to sample. My thought from the start has been only the best. Let's take those few instruments that I'm most proud of, most confident of their value and uniqueness, and let them be, my gift to the world. Thank you very much. But what Mike and others at Soundiron have said to me repeatedly is there's actually a lot of value for the user in having the most generous selection we can provide. We can't know in advance what's going to be just the right sound for someone at any given musical moment. And given that it's actually not difficult to scroll through a lot of candidate sounds looking for the right one, the best we can do for the user is to provide a lot to choose from. A valuable library is one that offers that. On several occasions, we've had a conversation like this. Me: well, we don't need to record this one because it's similar to that other one we already recorded. Mike: no, we need to include both in the collection because their sounds aren't identical, and we're going to do a hell of a job recording them so as to bring out the subtlest of differences, and someone might have reason to prefer one over the other. Anyway, there are lots of reasons why the idea of recording sample libraries is a particularly exciting one for these instruments. The main one is just that there are so many different sounds here, highly varied, lots of character, I'd like to think, many of them quite unique. So I have a hope that a lot of them will be useful to composers and musicians in many different genres. And the idea that I might get to hear how other composers would make use of my sounds, I get a big kick out of that idea. I'm pretty sure that people will do things with them that I would never have thought of in a million years.